myself on this matter as an observer rather than a participant. It seems obvious to me, looking from the outside, as it were, that mediations are going to increase, principally because access to justice is going to become more and more difficult. The reason for that is that access to justice, particularly on the civil side, is a very low priority with our present government. The prior government wasn't much better, and governments in the future will not be better, in my opinion, principally because they have higher priorities for spending money. Just for instance, on medical care. To improve the access to justice would require dramatic change in the present approach by government. The Minister of Justice would have to be moved to a much higher priority in cabinet to ensure access to money. That, by all accounts, particularly viewing the appointments of some of our more recent ministers of justice, is not going to happen. It seems to me that the problem with mediation online is going to resolve into the older lawyer, and let me be arbitrary and say lawyers over 45, of which I'm obviously one, are not only ignorant of online, but we're scared of it. And I think it's going to require a selling job of some sort to bring the older practitioners around. The good news on that point is that time will take care of it. And it should not be any stumbling block to continuing what you are outlining here. Once the profession is satisfied that security is ensured and travel is eliminated, online mediations will become much more attractive. Similarly, as technology improves and becomes easier, the slower learners among the lawyers will come on board. The question of security is always going to be somewhat of concern, although in most mediations that I've been involved in, you could really hold them in a public square for all of the confidentiality that means much. So while I think confidentiality in mediation is not a big priority, it's viewed differently by the parties involved, and so you have to ensure that there is security. But I think you have a lot of support in that regard by looking at the business community, directors' meetings of very large shareholding companies are conducted from Vancouver to Halifax. Highly confidential matters pertaining to the company are discussed. And the benefit, of course, to all that is cost. And the benefit to litigants should also be cost. That will be the biggest attraction, coupled with promptness. As I've heard it outlined this morning, it seems apparent that once the profession buys into online mediation, you can put them together much faster. The interesting aspect of the profession moving from my day to your day might have been seen this week when the Supreme Court of the United States, which is almost paranoid about security, found themselves conducting trial or appeals by telephone. So I think the mystique of the Supreme Court has somewhat lessened when people observe they can do it by telephone. All that points in favor of what you're trying to develop, that is online mediation. I doubt that what I've said is of much value, so I think I should stop now.
Thank you so much, Justice Major. I think we did find that very valuable. We thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments, but again, we want to, there's a very broad question, and I leave this to you to answer. If not, how would you change the justice system? That's for Mr. Kubitz.
Well, let me tell you, first I'd introduce two-tier medical coverage so that a huge amount of money going into medical care could be lessened if you had a private sector, as every other Western country that has Medicare does. There would be sufficient savings to permit what we call increased access to justice. In order to have that, you need more courthouses, more judges, more staff, and more interest. The Minister of Justice has to be seen as a senior portfolio, which it was in the days going back to R.B. Bennett, St. Laurent, and the older Trudeau. This sounds rather superficial, but those are the money is the answer to access to justice. And where are you going to get the money? The most obvious target to me is the huge amount going into medical care. We're not suggesting poor care, just more sensible care.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions. For Mark Hamilton, what, if any, thoughts do you have about an online court such as the Civil Resolution Tribunal in BC? This tribunal administers general civil claims under 5,000 and auto claims under 50,000. Mark's comments are that it eases access to justice but trades off some of the rules of evidence. Is this trade-off worth it?
Well, of course, that's a general question, and it depends what evidence you're trading off. But if you're saying that some compromise has to be made from in-person trials, I agree. But I think the access overcomes the impediments that may result from being online rather than being in person. It's going to be a little different. But what's important is to look at the essence of what the issue is that's being tried. If there's a lot of physical demonstrations, mechanical demonstrations, that may be more difficult. If it's viva voce evidence, there's not going to be a whole lot of difference in the way evidence is presented. One of the arguments, of course, is that the judge online can't study the witnesses with the same care in determining credibility. that the judge is handicapped by being online. But the fact is that the judges, generally speaking, don't determine credibility solely by the appearance or the manner in which the witness gives his evidence. It depends on what the evidence is that he gives and how it compares with other evidence that he's heard. So I think, generally speaking, the majority of trials, once the profession is satisfied on the efficacy of the technique, should increase, because, as I mentioned earlier, my hope of more money going into improving access is very pessimistic.
Thank you, Justice Major. And now we have a more controversial question. This comes from Steve Major. Who is your favorite son at the Calgary Bar, Peter or Steve?
That's Hobson's choice.
And one further question from Mr. Basil Banthal. In the courtroom, the majority of trials are open for public observation. If virtual trials start to happen, do you think this should still be allowed?
One of the myths is public participation in civil trials. Family or friends may show up, but using the Supreme Court as an example of public interest, there's probably limited seating. I would think 40 at the most, and it was a rare occasion that you had 40 people. A trial may be different, but go to any courtroom, and unless the matter has attracted public attention, and that generally is restricted to some kind of criminal trial, murder, embezzlement, that sort of thing, the public has very little interest in attending. So I think the fact that most civil trials would be online and not readily accessible to the public is a very minor concern. You could have a provision that the lawyers involved could apply for call it an in personam trial if they make the case that there's public interest and the public want to attend. You could, the majority would just don't attract public interest. And if there's one that does, the few that would, you can accommodate that by a judge's order.
Great, thank you, Justice Major. I think that's all of our questions so far and comments. I don't see any further follow-ups from Stephen or Peter Major. So I just want to thank you so much for your thoughtful and considered responses and for taking the time to be here today. It's very much appreciated.